Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to be going over our Intro to Evolution notes. So you should be able to see these notes in your Schoology folder in your interactive notes notebook. So go ahead, open these up. Congratulations, you are on the final unit for Pre-AP Biology. So that's really exciting and let's get started. So first off, we're going to open up our notebook. And just as always, you have your vocab list and your learning objectives on your second slide. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what evolution actually is. Okay, so for evolution, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put some of our definitions here. I'm going to get my notebook out so that way I know exactly what it is I'm going to write. So for evolution, we know this is a theory that explains how organisms change over time with adaptations. Okay. So you've probably heard about evolution before, and in all honesty, evolution is one of those hot topics that, a lot of people don't like to talk about. But in reality, we do see that, we have different types of evolution. So usually when we think about evolution, we think about, humans coming from monkeys, but, that is a form of macroevolution. And we have, some data towards that, but, there are different types of evolution. And so really what we're going to focus on is microevolution. So microevolution is the reason why whenever you use hand sanitizer, it doesn't kill all the bacteria that's actually on your hands. So if you read a bottle of hand sanitizer, so I have one right here, and it actually says on here, only 99.9% affected. And so that 0.1 bacteria that's left over, those are going to be alive because they're immune to hand sanitizer. And so because they're left alive, they're going to survive long enough to be able to reproduce. And then now all of a sudden we have this population of bacteria that will not die from hand sanitizer. And so that's why even if you use hand sanitizer, it's still always best to wash your hands because that will, for sure get rid of those bacteria. So how did we get to understanding evolution as we know today? So we actually have a couple of key scientists, and there's more than just these two. So these two are, a couple of the major scientists. You probably have heard of Charles Darwin, but, there are a few more than, just these two. So let's go ahead and write down, a couple of notes for these. So first off, okay, we have this gentleman, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Jean Lamarck, highlight this. Okay, so published a hypothesis of inheritance of acquired traits, okay, to explain how organisms change. Okay. So a good example, so I have this little comic here, okay, so he thought that over a period of your life, you could, have these traits that you get. Like, for example, if you go and you work out because you want to be stronger, and those traits will pass on to your children. And so the example that he gave has to do with giraffes. So he believed as the trees got taller, the giraffes would stretch out their neck and would magically, just start growing so their necks were longer. And so now, they would go on and reproduce and their babies would have the longer necks because they forced their necks to get longer. So we know that that doesn't happen. Okay, you have to have the trait to pass it on to your offspring. The reason why we still talk about this guy, though, is because he was the one that really noticed that, these traits do pass from parent to offspring. So he just kind of supported Mendel's ideas. So Charles Darwin is the father of evolution. So he was the one that began investigating evolution, and he began making observations of how traits get passed on, and the animals that have the best adaptations are the ones that are going to survive. Okay, so he sailed on the HMS Beagle and made observations of better adapted animals being the survivors and having offspring. Okay, I misspelled offspring. Okay. So we call that natural selection. And so Darwin is the one that really gets the credit for that. And so he did get a lot of, condensation for, his book and for, suggesting this. But that's because, you could see these pictures. These are black and white pictures. This was a really long time ago. And so it was a completely novel idea that organisms can change over time, and over a long period of time, you could have some really drastic changes. So let's go ahead and go over Darwin's theory. Okay. So for Darwin's theory, he made several observations. So one is that overpopulation does occur. Okay. So we know that organisms produce more offspring than can survive, and not all of the offspring reproduce. So he recognized that that could potentially be a problem. Okay. So he also recognized that there was competition. Okay, so competition for limited resources. Okay, and so that caused a struggle, or causes a struggle really, for existence. So if we look out in the wild, there's always competition for food, competition for space, competition for shelter, water, things like that. So there's always this battle that's going on. And, organisms might not always survive. So he also noticed, okay, that there's variations. Okay, so those are differences that exist, and they're passed from parents to offspring. Okay, so that ties in with what Mendel thought as well. So he also noticed, let's see here. So each species descends with changes from other species. And so that's called descent with modification. So once you have a change, once you have a mutation, if it's beneficial, it could stick around. And so if we have some sort of modification in a species, then it's going to be inherited from parent to offspring. And then lastly, okay, so he figured out natural selection. Okay, so individuals with adaptations that are best suited to their environment will survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits to their offspring. Okay, so that is called fitness. Okay, so usually when we think of fitness, we think of going to the gym. Okay, but in reality, for biology, fitness is actually talking about the ability to survive long enough in order to reproduce, and those offspring have to be able to survive. So you can have, maybe an organism that is the fastest. Like let's say that you have a cheetah, okay, and it's the fastest. He can hunt a lot of prey, and he has plenty of food. But let's say that there's something wrong, and he can only he only produces 2 cubs in his lifetime, versus maybe a slower cheetah that produces like 8 cubs in its lifetime. Okay, so even though that cheetah is slower, it produced more offspring, so it's actually more fit. So when we're talking about fitness, we're not talking about athletic fitness. We're talking about the abilities to survive long enough to be able to reproduce. Okay. So what are some other causes of evolution besides natural selection, what's it called, mutations and stuff like that? So we have something called genetic drift. Okay, so genetic drift are when you have completely random events that causes an influence on the population. A tornado goes through and wipes out part of the habitat. We have logging, on this picture. So like somebody's walking through and just squishes whatever bug just happens to be there. Okay, so that's genetic drift. They're random events that changes, which individuals are actually there. So we also have mutations. So these are changes in our DNA. Okay, so these changes in our DNA are going to create variation. So we can see if I have 2 green beetles. Okay, so for whatever reason, they have a mutated baby beetle that is brown. Okay, so if that mutation is favorable, that brown beetle will stick around. And then lastly, we have something called genetic recombination. So we already talked about meiosis. We talked about crossing over, and we can see right here these homologous pairs of chromosomes, they're touching, and so they're going to exchange genetic information. So this will create a variation, and that could be helpful or it could be harmful to an organism. All right, so we know that this is a theory, okay, but we do need to go over some of our evidences of evolution. Okay, and some of these are going to be really familiar to you. Okay, so first off, okay, we have our fossil record. So we know if we're digging, the further down we go, the older our fossils get. And so we're able to compare how those organisms are changing over a period of time. So organisms like insects, plants, even the things that we normally think about like dinosaurs, we can see how they changed over a period of time. So additionally, okay, we have something called biogeography. Okay, so you probably have heard of Pangea. So Pangea is the big supercontinent when all of our little continents were actually attached together. Well, we actually had several stages of supercontinents. And so another one is called, and I can never say this right, Gondwanaland. Okay, so we could see that it's starting to split up, not quite Pangea where it was one landmass, but eventually they're going to split off into other continents. So back then, we had this one giant species of birds, and we call those birds all together. We just call them radites. And so these birds, think of like ostriches and emus and stuff like that. So they all lived, not habitated, they all lived on this supercontinent. And then as that continent broke apart, they started to evolve into different species. And so now we could see that in South America, that's where our ostrich lives. Actually, I think they have that switch. So I think in South America is where the emu lives. And then in Africa is where our ostrich lives. And then in Australia, we have, I think it's called a rhea. And then we also have a cassowary. Cassowaries are really scary, in my opinion. And so, we have several species that are like that. Another example, so our armadillo and a pangolin. Pangolins live in Asia, armadillos live here. And, they do look very different, but they kind of do the same thing where they roll up in a ball and the outside, is kind of like an armor plate. So next, we have what's called a homologous structures. Okay, so remember homologous, we talked about homologous chromosomes. Homologous means the same. So these are similarities among buddy structures in vertebrates. Okay, so this is one of the things that gives evidence to descent with modification or having a common ancestor. So if you look at our arm, okay, and we divide up all of our bones, so we have our humerus, radius and ulna, metacarpals, carpals, phalanges. So all of those bones are actually the exact same bones that you're going to find in, let's say, a cat leg, or a dog leg, or a whale flipper, or a bat wing. Okay, so the bones, and you can see right here in this picture, they look different shaped, but they're actually the same bones. And so they're just adapted to whatever environment that organism lives in. So some examples, okay? So a human arm has the same bones as a whale flipper. Okay? So we can see they're all colored because those are the same. So over here, we have what's called a vestigial structures. So technically, our bodies and organisms' bodies have a use it or lose it, mentality. And so if a structure is not being used and it's not beneficial anymore, you're no longer going to see it. So for example, whales. Okay, we know whales don't have back legs, but at one point they had an ancestor that did, and we actually did see that in the fossil record. But even though they don't have back legs, they actually have pelvic bones that are kind of sitting in their abdominal cavity. And so we don't see these very often just because they're not attached to anything, they're not used. And so if a whale dies, it gets, decomposed and, broken off of the whale. And so, they do have these bones here, which are residual hind limbs. Okay, so whale pelvic bones. Okay, so another one that's a vestigial structure. So for us, the human appendix. Okay, you probably have heard of people getting their appendix removed, and that's because, we don't need it. And, doctors are actually in debate as to what it was actually used for. All right, so another evidence. Okay, we have something called embryology. So if I look at this picture, okay, so it's going by rows, and I have all these different organisms. If I look at this very top row, all of these things, these alien-looking things, they all look the same. If I didn't have the labels at the bottom, you wouldn't be able to tell which one is the fish and which one is the human. So because all of us start out the same, this is one of the evidences that suggests that at some point we had a common ancestor, and then, as time goes on, different species came about. So our last thing is going to be molecular evidence. So the more closely related the organisms are, the more similar the DNAs and amino acid sequences will be. So I have a chart here of amino acid sequences for hemoglobin. So that's part of your red blood cell. So I have a human, a horse, a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and a zebra. So we know zebras and horses, okay, pretty similar. But here's some DNA evidence to prove it, or amino acid evidence rather. If I look at their hemoglobin, they have the first 3 amino acids that are the same. So arginine, lysine, histine. Okay, arginine, lysine, histine. So it's just the last one that's different. If I look at a human versus a gorilla and a chimpanzee, again, okay, the first 3 are similar. So we have lysine, glutamine, histine, lysine, glutamine, histine, and lysine, glutamine, histine. Okay, so it's just these last ones, okay, that are different. And we can see that for humans, isoleucine is different from the gorilla, which is lysine. But we have the same sequence of amino acids as a chimpanzee. Okay, so here's my human. Okay, so I know a gorilla is closely related. Okay, and a chimpanzee. A chimpanzee is more closely related, though, than the gorilla based off of these amino acid sequences. So hopefully you understand all of this. So just let me know if you have any questions. And, we're almost done. Okay, so I will see you later. Bye.